Hi, this is Howard Cooper, and before we jump into this podcast interview, I just wanted to share that I've been lucky enough over the last couple of years to have interviewed a bunch of other leading therapists and agents of change, really exploring their take on everything rapid change related. What you're about to see was recorded a little while ago, but it still holds tremendous value if you're someone that wants to learn about how to help people make quick behavioural shifts. So I hope you enjoy, and to make sure you don't miss any of the new releases, then take action and click that subscribe button, and then you'll be kept in the loop when any new episodes come out. Welcome to the Rapid Change Matters podcast. My name is Howard Cooper, and for over 14 years now, I've been fascinated with helping people to create personal change quickly. But I still come across many who believe that lasting personal change has to take a long time, consisting of reliving traumas or deep psychological analysis, or simply that flawed notion that understanding why you have a problem will somehow make it go away. I'm on a mission to get people who work therapeutically with others to shift their thinking and realise that these beliefs are not written in stone. Rapid change can happen. So, to help you open up to what's possible, I'm interviewing top therapists and agents of change who are out there getting real results with real people really quickly. Before we get to the interview, I just wanted to let you know that I've written a quick-to-read, downloadable PDF on 5 strategies to amplify your client's response, with some great tips on getting your therapeutic suggestions to really sizzle. You can download this for free from rapidchange.works, where you can also find all the information about this episode and episodes still to come. Now, over to the interview. Today my guest is someone who's not only a teacher and developer in the field of neurolinguistics, but is someone who's been a leading voice and a creator of new approaches and procedures in NLP for over 30 years. He's an accomplished hypnotist, and having studied many different approaches to using this skill, he helps many individuals to make personal changes in the context of coaching, facilitation and training, focusing on creating change at an instinctive and unconscious level. I'm joined today, of course, by Michael Perez. Welcome, Michael.
It's great to be here.
It would be really great just to start out by maybe telling our listeners a little bit about you, what you do, and how you got started.
Sure. Well, I started out in kind of like the IT world. That's where my initial interests were. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that's often true in that part of the world is that very often people in that field might be great with computers and not necessarily great communicators or great with people. Mm-hmm. And so that was it. I originally started learning NLP in the context of teaching communications and communication skills to IT people. I noticed that as I taught kind of applications of NLP in the context of helping people to become better communicators, I noticed that their personal lives started to change in ways that were just, kind of ramifications of some of the things that I'd taught them in the classroom. And so I became intensely interested in the therapeutic aspects of NLP. And then after using that for a number of years, I started to run into kind of the what I might describe as kind of the edge cases, where a lot of the things that I learned in NLP were not necessarily immediately applicable. Mm-hmm. At that point, that's when I started to change my focus more towards hypnosis, and specifically more towards the hypnosis of Dr. Milton H. Erickson, who was a very, probably the greatest, arguably, but probably, in my opinion, certainly, the greatest hypnotist of the 20th century, because he was able to do things that I did not see happening outside of, with other therapists nearly as much. And so I spent about 5 years studying him. That was a deeply transformative experience, getting a chance to go through films and recordings and so on and so forth. And then finally, after that, the real, starting in the very late 90s, there was an absolute revolution in neuroscience because suddenly modern brain scanning equipment became available. And the moment that happened, the moment that suddenly we had modern brain scanners, we could watch a brain work. Because previously all of our understanding of brains had mostly come from damaged brains. And now we could watch healthy brains function. And that technology has gone from being very primitive to being much better. Of course, that process is still continuing, but as a result, we've had absolutely everything that we thought about the brain as of, let's say, 1990 has pretty much been upended by now. Mm-hmm. And certainly we're learning a lot more. Now, the thing is that although that's interesting in terms of trivia, because I just like to know how things work, so that's fun. But I think that the more that we understand about how things might function, the more that suggests some things that we might do as a result. And so, taking on board some of the things that cognitive neurosciences started to show us and transforming that into interventions in practice, or using at least that information to inform interventions in practice, and then, testing the result. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But that again has been a real, turning point in my career, and that's kind of brought me to now. Certainly that's the last 15 years of it, and here we are.
Great. And I'm really curious because there's this idea that you're creating change at an instinctive and an unconscious level.
Yes.
Could you explain that a little bit more to people that might be interested in learning what is an instinctive change or an unconscious change?
Sure. Well, the one thing that we can say and is that there is a massive evidence building to suggest that actually when you and I do stuff, we have a feeling like there is a thing we can refer to as consciousness. Mm-hmm. I usually like to refer to it as awareness because I think it's more accurate given what we're learning. But essentially what happens is that we feel like consciousness is responsible for what we do. So, for example, if I'm going to pick up my phone, for example, I would think to myself that I want to pick up the phone. I would pick up the phone, and I would think of that as being a conscious action. Mm-hmm. But of course, the reality is that the process of picking up the phone, and even the decision to pick up the phone, seems to be happening a long time before, at least a long time in terms of neurological chronology. It seems to be happening a long time before we are aware of making, quote, a decision, unquote. Mm-hmm. And so what this suggests is that basically we, because the old point of view, if you go back, you can do this with Freud, but you can go all the way back to Aristotle. And Aristotle, he used to use the metaphor of a person being a bit like a charioteer and his chariot and the horse. So the thing is that we have the will, the volition of the person is the charioteer. Mm-hmm. And then we have the impulses, the emotions, the drives, which are essentially the horse and the chariot. And so the charioteer has to wrestle and control the horse and train the horse so that the horse obeys, the charioteer. Mm. Okay, so that was that, and basically Freud. Now, when he did it, he changed it a little bit because he said it was a bit more like a man riding a donkey cart. And so the man is what Freud would refer to as the conscious mind, and the donkey and the donkey cart were what he would refer to as, in his words, the subconscious mind. Mm-hmm. Now, and of course, in Freud's cosmology, first off, it's to be lauded that he understood that there were things that were coming from outside of consciousness, just as Aristotle understood it. But essentially, the real kind of problem there is that Freud felt that that the good you, the real you, the person that essentially you are and should be, is your conscious mind, and the unconscious bit of your brain is kind of a cesspool of repressed evil.
Yeah.
So it's all the stuff about sex and then eventually death. After Jung talked him into including death as well as sex. And so this was all, of course, sex is bad and wrong. and so the end result is that all the stuff that you push down is the unconscious mind. And then, of course, all the good virtue and will and wisdom is the conscious mind. But essentially what we've been learning is that it turns out most of us seems to be unconscious. And it seems that awareness includes a certain awareness of what's going on in our minds, but not really complete. And there's an illusion that this awareness is responsible for the things that we do, even though, in fact, that doesn't seem to be true. Now, I'll give you the classic example. Everyone who has ever spoken, if we ask them, is your speech conscious? So in other words, are you making a conscious decision to speak, and the things you say, are they conscious things? And I think that most of us just at first glance would say, yes, of course. Speaking is a conscious action.
Yeah.
Otherwise it would be like some sort of, I don't know, like some kind of if you're in a trance and weird words are coming out, that would be something else. But that's not what's happening when we speak. But I would suggest rather that it is. Let me give you one example. Whenever, because for example, I'm talking right now and I can ask myself this question: where in consciousness am I creating the language that I'm speaking? Where am I parsing the sentence? Where am I determining what's the noun? What's the verb? What's the adverb? What's the adjective? What's the sentence structure? And of course that's the thing, is that speech, it turns out, is unconscious. And most of what we say, I mean, we may have a vague idea of what we want to say in advance and have an awareness of that idea, but speech actually comes from outside of consciousness, and our awareness of what we are saying usually happens, in terms of the exact language, tends to happen as we speak.
Yeah.
And so speech is an example of a perfectly conscious behavior that actually turns out to be quite unconscious. There are, there's a really good, it's a bit of an older book now, but it still has a lot of great points in it. It's by V.S. Ramachandran. It's called Phantoms in the Brain. Mm-hmm. And there's a number of experiments that you can do there, which in order to reveal what he refers to as the zombie. Mm-hmm. Because essentially he does a lot of stuff where he demonstrates that even though you think you have, quote, conscious, unquote, control of your hands and your motor function, he demonstrates some ways in which our cognitive awareness, our consciousness, can be fooled by certain illusions. And yet, when your body interacts with them, your body is not fooled. And so what's really interesting about that is this demonstrates that the stuff, the part of your brain that's moving your body around is using preconscious information that isn't subject to the flaw that causes the illusion to work. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, you're actually acting on more information than you have. And so this is really what it comes down to is the presuppositions of my work are pretty simple. We all know more than we think that we know. We base what we do and what we feel on this information. Consciousness attempts to make an explanation for it, and most of the time it succeeds. When it doesn't, or when we find ourselves doing things we don't want to do, or find ourselves not doing things that we do want to do, then that's usually when people call me. Mm-hmm. And what I do is I help them very specifically to have an experience that allows them to process this information in a way that that causes them not only to perceive all of the information that could affect the situation, so that they're not only having an intellectual understanding of it, but a deep understanding of it. And that deep understanding and the feelings that tend to arise from that also have a tendency then to affect behavior. So, so from that point of view, it's pretty simple. A lot of the stuff that has been, because look, we use the term hypnosis, and it's really important to understand that hypnosis is just a grab bag of different things, and many of these things seem to work for very different reasons. Hypnosis isn't one thing. It's just, here's a set of stuff that Mesmer did, and then a few other people did back in the day, that all got grouped together because they seem to all have the same sort of weird effects.
Yeah.
Even if they are a bit of a hodgepodge and a bit of a grab bag, because again, these people weren't systemic scientific thinkers all that much. Mesmer was mostly a stage performer, and and the one thing that Mesmer mostly did was he worked more as a gigolo than maybe as as a performer.
Okay.
And well, in those days, before we had an understanding of certain things, women were often diagnosed as having unrelieved tension. Mm-hmm. And this was considered problematic for them because it would make them frail and prone to the vapors and the faints. And so what would happen is that they would go in with this rather interesting man who would stare at them until he caused them to quiver and shudder, and they would release the tension, and then they would be all right. And actually, some of these ladies really liked having their tension relieved, so they tended to see him on a regular basis. So,
and they'd pay.
Oh, well, absolutely they would. Who wouldn't, for a nice tension reliever like that? I mean, there's an awful lot of people who've been paying that for that for a long time. And so I think it's the world's oldest profession, if I'm not terribly mistaken.
Absolutely.
But if you think about this as being kind of the modern origins of a lot of the stuff that we do in this context, that will give you a pretty good idea of exactly why it's a bit of a hodgepodge and why it's a bit of a shambles. Mm-hmm. And so I think that this is why, the cognitive neuropsychological stuff is really useful to sort of go in and create some working theories for how things might work. Understanding that they're just working theories, mm-hmm. and then use that to start to make some distinctions about, what does what and where is it useful and how is it useful. And so, what we're really doing is that we're taking something that maybe started in a place that's a little bit less than serious. But certainly, hey, look, what happened with Mesmer was a couple of doctors saw what he was doing. And they saw that he was literally just, there were people with legitimate medical conditions, and Mesmer suggested that they shouldn't have those anymore, and suddenly they didn't. Now, it wasn't consistent, and it didn't happen all the time, but sometimes it did. And so these doctors decided that they wanted to study what Mesmer was doing, not for the purposes of entertaining ladies with excessive tension, mm-hmm. But instead for the purposes of creating some kind of a therapeutic benefit. Also remember that this is the late 1800s, and during that time there was not such a thing as reliable anesthetics.
Yeah.
And so just even from the point of view of using it for, to put somebody into a sleep-like state, where they could be operated on without waking up screaming, that was already something.
Yeah.
So, so they tried to take it in a more scientific direction, but there has always been kind of the the kind of the tug of war between the people who want to use hypnosis primarily in the context of entertainment,
Yep.
and then others who want to use hypnosis as kind of for more altruistic purposes. Let us say, not that being entertained isn't lovely, but but certainly using it to help someone in a bad situation. And of course, there's been some arguments about the people who do it on stage, they create a bad reputation for the rest of us, and therefore they don't take us seriously. And then of course the people on stage are just going, well, that's just because you people, you don't know that we are actually spreading the word about hypnosis, and other people wouldn't know what it was like unless I had people dance with a mop and bark and cluck like chickens.
Sure.
So so it goes back and forth. But anyways, I do at least hope that one of the things that I bring to it is to attempt to start to look at it in a different way than we might have looked at it traditionally.
Yeah.
To start breaking it down to understand why things work the way that they do. And then understanding that if you go in and you help somebody to change the way that they think and feel at a deep level, very often trying to work via the surface cognitive level, like something like CBT, that's a lot of hard work because you're trying to change a pre-conscious response using conscious thinking.
Sure.
And that's essentially at the wrong logical level.
So where would you say, I mean, are there problems or issues that people could have where actually handling it at a conscious cognitive level is the way that actually you would go, or should change work be done always at that kind of pre-conscious, deeper level?
Well, it depends on, you deal with the issue where the issue is occurring. So for example, we have, there's a phrase from the Latin that we use when we're discussing logic, which is does not follow. Okay, this does not. This is a non sequitur. It does not follow. Very often, somebody has a problem because they have malformed logic. So they have a cognitive issue. They reasoned something once. They forgot what the reasoning was. And then they just essentially they keep it's like walking easterly in order to head in a westerly direction.
Yeah.
That is a fundamentally flawed strategy. You can walk from now until the end of the world in eastward, and you will never head west. I mean, at least north and south. Eventually, you'll hit the poles, and then you'll be going in the other direction. But as long as you're heading east, you'll never be heading west. And so the problem there is logic. The problem there is a strategy, and the problem there is, what you are doing does not follow. The thing you are doing does not result in the thing that you want to happen. If it's a question of logic and reason, then sometimes it's about essentially uncovering the logical structure, the thing that we've sort of forgotten about. What was our reasoning about this thing in the first place? Well, if you uncover it and reveal it, some of it's awful silly.
Yeah.
And we just immediately go, oh, well, of course, that's not right. And the moment that happens, that really kind of changes the world, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so, this is really a very powerful intervention to just go in and say, hey, look, this doesn't follow. And very often the person will immediately sort things out. But of course, in many cases, like, for example, if somebody comes in with a phobia, and maybe, if they happen to glance at a spider, maybe they jump up on a table or run out of the room or scream or something like that. Well, if you ask them the question, that tiny spider you saw, is it venomous? Could it kill you? They're going to say, well, it's unlikely. I think most people that I've ever dealt with who deal with kind of these irrational phobias understand that it's not rational. They understand the spider is actually not venomous. It's not going to be a black widow or a brown recluse or something like that.
Yeah.
And so they understand that what's actually happening here is that they're having some kind of a response, and they can't even control it. And they don't know why it's happening, and they're just terrified of these damn things. And can you please help? Well, if that's the case, I can try I try to do what CBT does, which is essentially desensitization process. Where I just keep showing them lots of spiders and making them read books about spiders and eventually movies about spiders until finally, they're in the room with a spider in a glass cage, and they manage to control their fear because they've gotten a lot of practice at doing that cognitively and using their willpower to sort of force themselves not to panic. But on the other hand, if I change it at a preconscious level so that they just suddenly aren't terrified of spiders at a deep level, then I don't have to go through 6 weeks of desensitization training. And when they see a spider, they don't jump up and start screaming. And in fact, they some people just can't even imagine that they ever did that. They don't that they did it, but it just doesn't seem like something that they could ever do. So that's the difference between my approach and that, and so that's why I think, again, if you're dealing with a preconscious response, you should deal with it preconsciously. If you're dealing with a logical response, you should deal with it logically. If it's rationality, then you should deal with it rationally. Like for like.
So these ideas of dealing with it preconsciously, as you would call it. There might be, there might be people out there, and that sounds a little bit out there, and they might be thinking, well, how would I do that? How do I deal with something preconsciously? Are these learnable skills?
No, not really. The thing is that when it comes to changing preconscious processing, it's not so much a skill as a way of looking at the world. We often talk about frames, cognitive frames, and basically a lot of times it has to do with the way that you're representing the world to yourself at a very deep level. Now, there are you can certainly change some of your own representations. That can be a very valuable process. For example, one thing that is a strong mediator of fear is how close something is. Just imagine for a moment, if you will, that you were in the room with a tiger. That probably would be a pretty terrifying experience if there wasn't something in between you and the tiger.
Sure.
Okay. Now, so if the tiger is 3 feet away, then that's a big issue. A meter away, it's a big issue. But what happens if the tiger is 100 meters away? If it's 100 yards away. Well, now it's very small, it's very far away, and you've got time to, get somewhere safe before that tiger can get to you.
Yeah. And
therefore, that tiger is going to be less scary than it would be if it was right up in your face and you had no time to run anywhere. Does that make sense?
Of course, yeah.
Okay, and so the end result is that so if you take an internal representation of something that you're scared of and you push it far away and you make it small and distant and dim, you might notice that the fear reaction also is less intense. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if you've got something you really like, if it's distant and far away, if you bring it up close and you make it vivid and colorful and bright, well, then suddenly the intensity of the nice feeling that you get from that thing, you may well find that it increases. So this is, it's less of a skill and more of just an idea that you can use to help yourself change the way that you feel about something by just changing your mental representation of it. But what I would say is that if you have a more serious problem like a full-blown phobia or something like that actually is probably a time when you want to talk to somebody and get some facilitation rather than trying to do it yourself.
Sure. And those ideas of pushing images away or moving them closer and essentially sort of shifts in submodalities.
Yes.
How would that be dealing with things at a pre-conscious level?
Well, the point is that you respond pre-consciously to the stimuli in your environment. And so even though you are purposefully making a change in your representation, the representation is the thing being responded to. And so therefore, if you're in a different environment, then you're going to have different responses. And those are going to be both cognitive and preconscious responses. So certainly, again, and that's one of the reasons why, even though that's a simple exercise, and that's certainly something that most people can do very easily. This is the reason why facilitation is really useful, because I can make that kind of a process much more profound by putting someone into a specifically altered state of consciousness, where they become even more hyper responsive to the way that internal imagery changes, the way that internal conceptualization of something changes, the way that a metaphor, what something might be like changes. You know, so certainly, there are levels at which we can do this. And so that's why, because otherwise, if everything was very simple and you could just walk yourself through it step by step, there would be no reason for me to spend 30 years doing what I do.
Sure.
Because I could have, I could just give people a set of instructions and have them follow through on them.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be as simple as that. Let's face it, 99.999% of the issues that we run into in our lives, we don't require assistance in solving, and they eventually either we work them out or they work themselves out. Is that a fair thing to say?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what we are here for as facilitators is for the 0.0001%, those very few things that intrude on people's lives and can't be dealt with easily, or, of course, and this is kind of, because it's so easy to get caught up in this kind of therapeutic mindset, which is a problem in and of itself. Treating, thinking as sickness is a problem, in my opinion. But also remember that a lot of the work that I do is actually working with top performers to get better at what they do. So I work with athletes. I've one female weightlifter broke a world record right after a session that I did with her, just because essentially, and again, she's a brilliant lady and a keen athlete, but it was just changing the way that she thought about it, allowed her to access her physiology differently, and that allowed her to break a world record.
Huh. Well, that kind of leads me really nicely on to something else that I'd like to talk to you about. I'm wondering whether you could share with us a couple of case studies or a couple of times that you worked with someone that typically therapy hadn't helped that well, traditional models hadn't necessarily done the stuff, but actually they came to see you and they achieved something, they achieved a result.
Well, essentially that's my career. It's hard to pick out one particular case because I probably have 8 or 9 cases like that a week on an average week. But the basic, just to kind of step away from the story for a moment and just kind of give the larger frame. For a very long time, and this has changed very recently, but for a very long time, the only thing we had was psychoanalysis. And whether it was Freudian or Jungian or Rogerian, we had this psychoanalytical idea that a therapist and a person would sit down and the therapist would ask questions without providing necessarily specific advice, but they would just ask questions and the person would review their situations over and over and over and over again until at some point they would have some kind of an epiphany. And then, theoretically that breakthrough would be the thing that would allow them to say, okay, well, I've gotten my, the thing that I wanted to have happen. Now the problem with that is that the time scale on that was very often in not only in terms of years, but in terms of decades. It was very common for somebody to be in therapy for 30 years about something and not happen to hit on that magical epiphany, whatever that was.
Yeah.
And the people who were facilitating it were very often very caring and compassionate people, but they really didn't necessarily understand what it was that caused these epiphanies to happen when they happen, and therefore all they could do was just guide people through a process that was marginally possibly related to them and see what happened. Now, the one thing that happened, of course, more recently is that a lot of psychoanalysis has been replaced by more modern methodologies like CBT, or even more recently kind of mindfulness-based methodologies. And these certainly are more effective. They do work better. But there we're talking about months instead of weeks, and basically the kind of stuff that traditionally people who do competent hypnotists, not all hypnotists are competent, many of them are not, but competent hypnotists, a competent neurolinguist very often can help somebody to get a resolution to an issue, not in terms of years or even in terms of months, but often in terms of weeks, and occasionally for some issues, even in terms of a single session. So single sessions are a little bit, we have a tendency to pull towards the single session model for everything in our field, because it's just like, well, if we can do it fast, we might as well do it as fast as possible. I think that sometimes we pull a little bit too far in that direction, creating too much of an expectation that all change should be instant. But of course, much change is, and much more of it than we would certainly expect by looking at the psychotherapeutic model.
Sure.
But what we would also see is that, so for example, one of my clients was seeing me around panic attacks, and they had some rather severe anxiety, and so and they had been on medication for it for some time. Now, I suggested that they start to look at the things that they do prior to doing these panic attacks. And then once they kind of had an understanding of what some of those things might be, I used some hypnosis to help them to do something different prior to what previously would have been a process that led to an escalation to a panic attack. Now, once that happened, once they were essentially disconnected from that process, they suddenly stopped having panic attacks. I guess they could potentially go back and have them if they did the thing that they used to do, but they don't do that anymore. And the way that I got them to stop doing it, because of course most of it was happening outside of their consciousness, even though we did an examination of it that helped them to become more conscious of what that process might be. The real change was pre-conscious, because it was about changing the way that they react to certain things so that they had different instinctive reactions than they had prior to seeing me. And so as a result, suddenly, they found themselves not doing the things that caused them to have a panic attack. And, hey, that worked. See, very often when I see people, I am the court of last resort.
Yep.
I very often see people who have already seen people who have already seen people. And finally, somebody refers them to me. And so by the time that I see clients, they have a tendency, rather than to worry about something taking a long time or anything of the sort, they're mostly saying, you know what, I'm pretty sure that I'm stuck like this, and that's just the way I will always be.
Yep.
And so basically when I engage with them, I just tell them, I said, well, that's fine, but I know one thing about you, and that is that you are sitting here with me. Now, if you are sitting here with me, it means that you cannot think that this is absolutely pointless, because otherwise you just throw money out the window instead of sitting across from me. So therefore, the fact that you are here is more than enough of a buy-in for me to help you to get what you need. The only thing that I ask is that you play along. Even if you don't fully believe it, I don't care. Just play along with what we do, and you'll start to get a result. When you start to get a result, then we don't have to worry about whether or not you believe it. Especially since I have a tendency to use hypnosis quite a lot in my work. The moment that I'm sitting down talking with somebody and suddenly it's 40 minutes later and they don't remember anything that happened, that's a pretty strong indicator that something weird just happened. And so I don't have to worry about proving anything to anybody.
Yeah.
I just do what I need to do in order to help them to go into a very perfectly natural but different in terms of the sort of state you go into in the course of a regular conversation. But they go into a certain kinds of neurological states that are more valuable for doing the kind of work that I do. And when that happens, they understand that happened.
Yeah.
And that's usually, again, that's more than enough to let people know that something unusual happened, and therefore that raises their expectations. And then, of course, luckily, the work that I do usually also helps to fulfill those expectations, as well as those expectations helping to make the work more valid.
I think it's interesting, and I'm imagining listening to this as someone who maybe hasn't come across hypnosis before, and I think some of these things would sound quite incredible,
yes.
and quite out there, and I know for many models they talk about having empathy and having rapport with a client to help them facilitate change.
The one thing that I would say is that different people need different things. My job, as far as I understand it, is I am the person who has the flexibility. If my client came in with the flexibility that they already wanted, then they would have done it.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to sit down and pay me to fix a problem that they could have fixed themselves 5 minutes ago.
Sure.
Okay, so once that comes to be the issue, once they've hired me as a consultant to help them to transform their thinking or reconnect with ways they used to think or whatever it may be, then one thing that automatically is fundamentally true is that at that point I need to be the person that they need me to be, so that they can become the person for whom that change not only is easy, but is absolutely intrinsic and unavoidable. Very often, an old friend of mine, Joe Riggio, he says, who are you when you're the person who can't have the problem? And I think that that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, and so in order for me to help the person to be the person who simply cannot have that problem, then I have to be the person who can facilitate them through that. If that means that I need to be a bit of a taskmaster, then I'm happy to do that if that's what they need. If that means that I need to be I need to really demonstrate empathy and care, then I'll do that too. The real trick, and essentially, again, kind of the expertise in doing what I do, is to understand what people need, and to elicit that, and to calibrate that, and then to feed back to them whatever it is that they need in order to make that switch and to change that behavior, whether it's a bad for the good, or a good for the better, or a better for the excellent.
So this is about having a flexibility of approach and giving people, and being able to calibrate to give people what they need to have the experience of change.
Sure.
Are there any no-go areas for you in things in terms of, I know some people talk about, regression, and, I'm always looking for the root cause of something. And are there things that you go, well, look, I just don't ascribe to that model, I won't do that?
There are some things Mesmer used to do that I probably wouldn't do. Probably because I think now I live in Belgium, and such things can be legal, but I think you do have to have a license.
Sure.
So I probably will stay away from some of those things. At least not in my professional life. But see, this is the thing. I really find that that it's I like to leave my options open to do just about anything that I need to do.
Mm-hmm.
I just have never found that re-traumatization was necessary in order to help one of my clients to recover so far, or to help somebody, to change their way of thinking. So I am perfectly open to one day absolutely traumatize the crap out of somebody if I think it'll help them.
Mm-hmm.
But it certainly hasn't showed up yet.
Yeah.
But what can I say? The thing is that, look, also to be very clear, I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on television.
Mm-hmm.
I have no medical credentials, real or imagined, and as such, I do not claim to treat medical issues.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I also sharply disagree about what constitutes a medical issue when it comes to having a kink in your think.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's not necessarily something that is a sickness, even though it is often classified as such and often unsuccessfully treated with medication.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not my place to pass medical judgments. And if people have medical issues, I send them to proper clinicians to deal with those medical issues. So I look at the work that I do as being strictly, I don't even think of it as, quote, alternative therapy, although I know many think of hypnosis in that context. I simply think of it as a way of changing thinking. Mm-hmm. And when you change thinking, it also changes feeling, and that also in turn changes behavior. So, so just to make it very clear, I don't treat illnesses. Nevertheless, what I would have to say is, and look, it's pretty simple. If somebody comes to me, let's say that there is such a thing for a moment as clinical depression that cannot be managed without medical treatment.
Yeah.
If somebody comes to me and we have a couple of conversations, and as a result, they don't feel so bad anymore, then fine. I didn't cure clinical depression because clinical depression could only be cured with drugs. So let's just say that they were misdiagnosed. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I've never met a person who was diagnosed that wasn't misdiagnosed in time. But I'm willing to believe that there is somebody who is correctly diagnosed and can only be treated with SSRIs or similar. Mm-hmm. I just don't know who that person is.
Here's the thing. If there are people out there who are listening and they want to know more, or they are thinking to themselves, look, I would like to discover more about, how you can go about helping someone at a pre-conscious level, or helping someone in a more direct solution-focused manner, and being flexible in the way that we're talking about, mm-hmm. What would you recommend as a good start for them? What books, what trainings, how should they embark on that journey?
See, and this is kind of interesting. I really... I'll tell you just a very quick story. When I was 12 years old, I was already 6'3", and I've got to tell you that I am not a tall person. A tall person is usually sort of stretched out a bit. I am like a normal sized person scaled up. Mm-hmm. So as a result, I'm kind of massive, and so I actually had a bit of a problem because I was also really crazy strong, without ever having worked out or done anything like that. And so while other kids wanted to learn how to fight to protect themselves from bullies and such, I was actually a bit afraid to fight because I might accidentally break somebody. So the end result is that I never actually learned how to fight. And in that way, at least, my parents finally relented and they allowed me to take judo lessons. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, when I went to go take these judo lessons, they insisted on pairing me up with a very tiny blonde girl whose face, her pale complexion was always fire engine red for the entire session. And I just got so upset watching her be so huffing and puffing and burning red that I finally dropped out of the judo because I just couldn't stand to see her anymore. Mm-hmm. And so but what I really wanted to learn was karate, and my mother said, no, you'll kill somebody. So, but what I did, because I was a studious fellow and I liked books and I loved reading, is I went to the shop and I found an illustrated guide to karate. And so I bought this book, and it had all these amazing pictures of karate, and I taught myself karate from this book. Now I have to tell you that the karate that I did probably bore no resemblance to any actual karate of any kind, nor to any martial art that would be of any value to anyone in an actual fight of any sort. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, I did meticulously attempt to reproduce the poses out of the book, and came away with something that was almost certainly not karate, and yet certainly bore some resemblance to what was going on in the book. I have a tendency to think about hypnosis as a conversation, and I think that trying to learn how to have a conversation from a book is problematic. Mm-hmm. So my personal recommendation would be, if you want to learn something like neurolinguistics, NLP, or hypnosis, very often there are things called practitioner groups. And these are people who just get together to practice NLP with one another. I would very strongly recommend hooking up with a practitioner group and watching people who are already trained in doing NLP, watching what they do. Get your first experience there, and that will give you a whole body experience. Again, it's like reading about kissing in a book versus getting kissed. It's much better to just get the kiss, even if your first kiss is terrible, because it's going to be very different from whatever you imagine from reading that book about kissing, or dancing or any other full contact sport. I think that hypnosis and NLP are full contact sports. So go and find the people who know how to do it. If you can't find that, contact if there's local trainers in your area. See if they do taster evenings. See if they do small presentations. Get an idea of what they're doing. See if they can put you in contact with a practice group. Sometimes some NLP trainers run practice groups for their students, and maybe they'll let you sit in. But anyone worth their salt is happy to demonstrate. And I'd say go have the experience.
I think that's such great advice. I really do. And I know a lot of people who, can read. They read all sorts of stuff and they accumulate lots and lots of knowledge. But hey, guess what? You ask them to demo something and they can't do it.
Absolutely.
And isn't this all about doing it and creating experiences for people?
Well, in fact, I would even say, just to go one step further, the problem is that if you pick up bad habits because you don't really understand something and you try to learn it from a book, then you have to unlearn before you can learn.
Yeah. And
it actually makes things a little bit more difficult than it might have been otherwise if you would have kind of started from the experience and then use that to inform the next study that you do after that. See, because I don't mean to say that books are not valuable. What I mean to say is that, so for example, that book on karate, I'm sure that if I were a practitioner of karate, that book on karate probably had many great distinctions about where to put your feet and how to do what, by watching this really great, Japanese master. Mm-hmm. And so once I have a full body sense of what karate is, then I can certainly take pointers from that book and have it be much more valuable than it would have been to me knowing nothing about the form.
And if people want to know more about you and the work that you do, or want to get in touch with you, how best should they do that?
Well, the easiest thing to do is just go over to michaelperezhypnosis.com. It's all one word, michaelperezhypnosis.com. Mm-hmm. And once you get there, you can, the first session with me is always free, because I like to sit down and talk with people and decide, understand what the issue is and decide whether we're happy to work together. But certainly, I'd be glad to have a sit down and talk with any of you if you've got an issue. And also, I do trainings and that sort of thing. You can also, get in contact with me if you'd like to know the next time that I'm teaching the material. I often do those trainings in the UK, but I know I've got some upcoming trainings going on in India, possibly one in Thailand pretty soon. So, I'm all over the place.
Amazing.
And you may very well find yourself very near a location where I am, or perhaps wanting to go to one of those locations just for a nice vacation anyway. Why not take a
Either way, it sounds like a glamorous life.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
So that's the thing. The brain is a glamorous thing.
I couldn't agree more. And just to reassure everyone, all of the links to your website and that information we will put in the info on the podcast and also on the Rapid Change website as well.
Fantastic.
Well, look, I've got to thank you for going through this with me and for speaking to all the listeners at home as well. Is there anything that we haven't covered that actually would be interesting, given the idea of rapid change, that actually would be worth chatting through or talking about?
Well, the one thing that I would say is that there's a song that I really liked from, I think it was like the 90s, and I think it was Alita Adams, and the song was called "The Rhythm of Life." And there was a line from the song that's always stuck in my head. Because it uses the metaphor of describing, the rhythm of life as being like a Chinese dragon. But then she says, at another point, she says, the rhythm of life is the force of habit. And I think that's really interesting, because if you think about most of our lives, most of us on most days essentially do the same things over and over again. We have certain patterns that we run, and the days that are mostly exceptional are the days that don't necessarily conform to those patterns. It's when something remarkable or unusual happens, whether it's remarkably good, remarkably bad, or just remarkably remarkable. That's when things stand out to us.
Yeah.
So, so what I would say is that, because very often people are all about peak moments. I want to make my life better by just having this amazing experience. But I think that what really happens is that the stuff that happens to us every day is what sets the baseline for our felt sense of the world. That's what creates our sense of well-being, our sense of satisfaction. And I would say that there is a really important unconscious part to that, because most of us have a tendency to lose ourselves in the familiar. We zone out. We're off thinking about other things. We're singing Bohemian Rhapsody in our head, whatever. and so as a result, we lose our sense of the moment. But that's fine. It lets us do even kind of drudgery or repetitious things and still keep ourselves occupied and entertained on some level. But I think that if you take a moment to examine that stuff in your life, there are some very basic habits that you could create or add to what you do now. Maybe a few habits that you'd like to change into something else entirely. But that if you change them so that they happen preconsciously and easily every day, then it raises the baseline of your life. So that, if you think about the lowest of the lows and the highest of the highs, those are all relative to the baseline. Well, if your baseline is higher, that means that your lows aren't as bad and your highs are better. Now, I think that that's really something that most people don't give attention to, because most of us are trying to fix crises. Most of us only really pay attention to this stuff when something is so wrong that it's disrupting our life. And I'd like to say that if you want to make this kind of change, the rhythm of life is the force of habit. And if you change your habits, then you change your life. And you can create a much more satisfying, a much more livable life than maybe the one that you have right now. So I would suggest that don't just think about this in terms of problems to fix. Think about this in terms of improvements to make. Sometimes we get caught up in the idea of life as revolution, but in fact, life can be evolution. And sometimes it's just about the gradual rising and advancing of a spirit, like a Chinese dragon.
Really, really nice. And I hope everyone listens to your words intently. So listen, thank you so much. Again, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you, and I hope everyone at home has enjoyed this as much as I have.
Howard, it has been absolutely a pleasure. And one of these days, maybe I'd love to come back on and talk with you some more.
That would be absolutely great, and an invitation I would definitely take you up on.
Wonderful.
Thanks a lot, Michael.
Have a great day, and thanks again to everybody who hung out with us. We really appreciate you, and I appreciate you putting up with me, so thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, why not share it with anyone you think might be interested, and even head over to iTunes to give us a glowing review. You'll find more about what's coming up on our Facebook page, facebook.com/rapidchangeworks. And of course, you'll find all the links related to this episode, plus those free 5 steps to getting your suggestions to sizzle over at rapidchange.works.